Hey guys, and welcome back to the Rhode Island Computer Museum. My name is Sam, and today we're going to be taking a look at a computer from the warehouse here, and this is the Commodore 64. Now the Commodore 64 was released in 1982 for about $595 US, which is about $1,500 today. And that may seem like a lot of money, but at the time that was actually a low-end computer. The Commodore 64 is often credited as being one of the highest selling single computers of all time, between 10 to 17 million units sold in its entire lifetime. And the console was on the market for about 11 years, being finally discontinued in 1994. So at the heart of the Commodore 64 is an 8-bit MOS technology microprocessor, and that is the 6510, which is compatible with this 6502 microprocessor, which is in a wide variety of home computers and game platforms of the era. In addition to the microprocessor, you also have 64K of RAM built in, which is where the name Commodore 64 comes from. But only about 38K of that is available to the user. Upon powering on the computer, it boots right to BASIC 2.0 and displays right at the top of the screen that about 38K is available. The rest of the memory is being used for functions within the computer upon powering it on. So the BASIC 2.0 is built into this machine, included in the 20K of ROM that's in here, which also includes a character generator and the kernel. Now there is a wide variety of peripherals you can get for the Commodore 64, but some of the most popular items besides a printer and a modem are things like this, and this is the 1541 floppy drive and the 1702 monitor. And of course, I can't talk about hardware for the Commodore 64 without talking about the SID chip. And this SID chip is primarily the sound chip inside the Commodore 64. And the Commodore 64, besides being known for great graphics, was one of the first platforms to really start pushing sound inside of a game. And you have some of the very first games that have really great music were on the Commodore 64. So the Commodore 64 is primarily remembered as being a great games machine of the mid-1980s. It had built-in support for hardware sprites, which its predecessor, the VIC-20, did not. It had great color and it had great sound. But one of the things that's often overlooked about the Commodore 64, and one of its biggest contributions, was that the Commodore 64's success really showed that a home computer geared and marketed towards the low-end user could be extremely successful. And as a result, because the computer was supported for so long and there were so many units sold, many people got their start in computing at home on the Commodore 64. As far as collectability goes, the Commodore 64, because there were so many made, is relatively cheap to get. You can probably get a basic unit consisting of just the computer itself for about $20 to $40. But one thing you should keep in mind when buying one of these is that the power supplies are often faulty. They may seem like they work, but they output too much power, which can damage the computer over the long run. So you really gotta make sure that you test the power supplies before you damage your machine. Now, peripherals for the machine are also not very hard to come by. The disk drives are pretty common, and the monitors, though you can find them, are a little bit harder to find, and they're really highly sought after because these CRTs can break and they can get damaged. As far as software goes, you can find floppy disks very, very easily online, and if you know what you're doing, you can download the software, the ROMs on the internet, and put them on a floppy drive if you can do that yourself. You can buy ROM cartridges like this from the 1980s. These can be a little bit more expensive simply because they're easier to use as they just plug into the back of the machine. But if you are okay with using floppy disks and getting a floppy drive, you can get yourself a Commodore 64 setup for a relatively cheap price. Because there were so many software titles released, I've heard almost 10,000 titles were released in total, which is good and bad. It means that prices are low for collecting the floppy disk because no one's trying to get a whole collection, and it's relatively easy for you to amass a collection of games on floppy disk for a relatively cheap price. And here we're going to be taking a closer look at the Commodore 64 itself. As you can see, it has a full travel keyboard, and this is the same keyboard that was used in the Commodore VIC-20. In fact, the case is very similar to the Commodore VIC-20, which is of course the predecessor to the 64. Here you have some function keys on the side and the regular QWERTY style keyboard. You may see some different color variations for the Commodore 64, but for the most part, this breadbin model is going to be the most common version of the Commodore 64 that you come across, and there are several other ones that are more rare and obscure, like the C64 game system and things like the Educator 64. But there's also the later release of the Commodore 64, the 64C. On the side of the Commodore 64, you have two joystick ports, which is an upgrade from the VIC-20, which had only one. And these are 9-pin joystick ports, which are the same as the Atari 2600. So any Atari-style joystick, as we call them, will work fine on the Commodore 64. And also you have a power switch right here and the power plug right there. On the back of the system, you have a cartridge port, which is in the same location as on the VIC-20 once again. but these are obviously not compatible with the VIC-20. These are much, much smaller. Next to that, you have a channel select switch and an RF output. And that would be the primary way that most people will be connecting a Commodore 64 to be displayed, would be on a television, because it is much, much cheaper. And if you didn't want to use a television, you have a monitor output right here, and it outputs in composite. However, the Commodore 64 also outputs in Chroma Luma, which is basically S-Video. So if you had a Commodore 1702 monitor, you could hook up this computer by Chroma Luma, which gives you an incredibly sharp and crisp picture, which is probably one of the best outputs, in my opinion, of any vintage 80s computer. Floppy drive port next to that. Moving over, you have a dataset port right there, and an RS-232 port to connect to printers. So guys, that's it. This is just a quick look at the Commodore 64, one of the most iconic and influential computers of the 1980s. And if you're trying to get into vintage computing and collecting, this is certainly one of the best options for you to start with.